Section 13 of Astounding Stories 8, August 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Howell. Astounding Stories 8, August 1930, by Arthur J. Burks. Murder Madness, by Murray Leinster, Chapter 15. Bell has fought through tremendous obstacles to find and kill the Master, whose diabolical poison makes murder-mad snakes of the hands. And as he faces the monster at last, his own hands start to writhe. The door of the car swung wide, and Ortiz's pale, grim face peered in behind the blue steel barrel of his automatic. He smiled queerly at Jameson with a grunt of relief, tapped Bell's wrist in sign to put away his weapon. "Ah, very well," said Ortiz, with the same queer smile upon his face. "One moment." He disappeared. On the instant there was the thunderous crashing of a weapon. Bell started up, but Jameson thrust him back. Then Ortiz appeared again, with smoke still trickling from the barrel of his pistol. "I have just done something that I have long wished to do," he observed coolly. "I have killed the chauffeur and his companion. You may alight now. I believe we will have half of an hour, or more. It will do excellently." He offered his hand to Paula as she stepped out. She seemed to shudder a little as she took it. "I do not blame you for shuddering, señorita," he said politely. "But men who are about to die may indulge in petty spites. And the chauffeur was a favorite with the deputy for whom I am substituting. Like all favorites of despots, he had power to abuse, and abused it. I could tell you tales, but refrain." The car had come to a stop in what seemed to be a huge warehouse, and by the sound of water round about, it was either near or entirely built out over the harbor. A large section near the outer end was walled off. Boxes, bales, parcels, and packages of every sort were heaped all about. Bell saw crated air engines lying in a row against one wall. There were a dozen or more of them. Machinery, huge cases of foodstuffs. "The Buenos Aires depot," said Ortiz almost gaily. "This was the point of receipt for all the manufactured goods which went to the fazenda of Cuyaba, Senor Bell. Since you destroyed that place, it has not been so much used. However, it will serve excellently as a tomb. There are cases of hand grenades yonder. I advise you to carry a certain number with you. The machine guns for the aircraft, with their ammunition, are here." He was hurrying them toward the great walled-off space as he talked, his automatic serving as a pointer when he indicated the various objects. "Now here," he added as he unlocked the door, "is your vessel. The Master bought only amphibian planes of late. Those for Cuyaba were assembled in this little dock and took off from the water. Your destruction up there, Senor Bell, left one quite complete but undelivered. I think another crated is still in the warehouse. I have been very busy, but if you can fuel and load it before we are attacked." They were in a roofed and walled but floorless shed built into the warehouse itself. Water surged about below them, and on it floated a 5-passenger plane, fully assembled and apparently ready to fly, but brand new and so far unused. "I'll look it over," said Bell briefly. He swung down the catwalk painted on the wings. He began a swift and hasty survey. Soot on the exhaust stacks proved that the motors had been tried at least. Everything seemed trim and new and glistened in the cabin. The fuel tanks showed the barest trace of fuel. The oil tanks were full to their filling plugs. He swung back up. "Taking a chance, of course," he said curtly. "If the motors were all right when they were tried, they probably are all right now. They may have been tuned up, and may not. I tried the controls, and they seem to work. For a new ship, of course, a man would like to go over it carefully. But if we've got to hurry..." I think, said Ortiz and laughed, that haste would be desirable. Herr Wedekind, no, amigo mio, that was that damned Antonio Calles who listened to us last night. I found pencil marks beside the listening instrument. He must have sat there and eavesdropped upon me many weary hours, and scribbled as men do to pass the time. He had a pretty taste in monograms. I gave all the orders that were needful for you to take off from the flying field. I even went there myself and gave additional orders. And Caius was there. Also others of the master's subjects. My treason would provoke a terrible revenge from the master, so they thought to prove their loyalty by permitting me to disclose my plan and foil it at its beginning. I would have made the journey with you to the master, but as a prisoner, with the tale of my treason written out. So I returned and changed the orders to the chauffeur, when all the master's loyal subjects were waiting at the flying field. But soon it will occur to them what I have done. They will come here. Therefore, hasten. We want food, said Bell evenly, and arms, but mostly we want fuel. We'll get busy. He shed his coat and picked up a hand truck. He rammed it under a drum of gasoline and ran it to the walkway nearest to the floating plane. Coiled against the wall, there was a long hose with a funnel at its upper end. In seconds, he had the hose end in one of the wing fuel tanks. In seconds more, he had propped the funnel into place and was watching the gasoline gurgling down the hose. "Paula," he said curtly, "watch this. When it's empty, roll the drum away so I can put another in its place." She moved quickly beside it, throwing him a little smile. She set absorbedly about her task. Jameson arrived with another drum of gas before the first was emptied, and Bell was there with the third while the second still gurgled. They heaped the full drums in place, and Jameson suddenly abandoned his truck to swear wrathfully and tear off his spectacles and fling them against the wall. The bushy eyebrows and beard peeled off. His coat went down. He began to rush loads of foodstuffs, arms, and other objects to a point from which they could be loaded on the plane. Ortiz pointed out the things he pantingly demanded. In minutes, it seemed, he was demanding, "How much can we take? Any more than that?" "No more," said Bell. "All the weight we can spare goes for fuel. See if you can find another hose and funnel and get to work on the other tank. I'm going to rustle oil." He came staggering back with heavy drums of it. A thought struck him. "How do we get out? What works the harbor door?" Ortiz pointed, smiling. "A button, senor, and a motor does the rest." He looked at the watch. "I had better see if my fellow subjects have come." He vanished, smiling his same queer smile. Bell worked frantically. He saw Ortiz coming back, pausing to light a cigarette, and taking up a hatchet, with which he attacked a packing case. "They are outside, senor," he called. "They have found the signs of the car entering, and now are discussing." He plucked something carefully from the packing box and went leisurely back toward the door. Bell began to load the food and stores into the cabin, with sweat streaming down his face. There was the sound of a terrific explosion, and Bell jumped savagely to solid ground. "Keep loading. I'll hold them back," he snapped to Jameson. But when he went pounding to the back of the warehouse, he found Ortiz laughing. "A hand grenade, senor," he said in wholly unnatural levity, "among the subjects of the master. I believe that I am going mad to take such pleasure in destruction. But since I am to die so shortly, why not go mad if it gives me pleasure?" He peered out a tiny hole and aimed his automatic carefully. It spurted out all the 7 shots that were left. "The man who poisoned me," he said pleasantly. "I think he is dead. Go back and make ready to leave, Senor Bell, because they will probably try to storm this place soon, and then the police will come. And then... It is amusing that I am the one man to whom those enslaved among the city authorities would look for the master's orders." Bell stared out. He saw a small horde of people, frantically agitated, milling in the cramped and unattractive little street of Buenos Aires waterfront. Sheer desperation seemed to impel them, desperation and a frantic fear. They surged forward, and Ortiz flung a hand grenade. Its explosion was terrific, but he had perhaps purposely flung it short. Bell suddenly saw police uniforms, fighting a way through to the front of the crowd and the source of all this disturbance. "Go back," said Ortiz seriously. "I shall die, Senor Bell. There is nothing left for me to do. But I wish to die with Latin melodrama." He managed a smile. "I will give you 10 minutes more. I can hold the police off themselves for so long. But you must hasten, because there are police launches." He held his hand out. Bell took it. "Good luck," said Ortiz. "You can come," began Bell, wrenched by the gaiety on Ortiz's face. "Absurd," said Ortiz, smiling. "I should be murder-mad within 3 days. This is a preferable death, I assure you. 10 minutes, no more." And Bell went racing back and found Jamison rolling away the last of the fuel drums, and Paula looking anxiously for him. "Tank's full," said Jamison curtly. "Everything set? What next?" "Engines," said Bell. He swung down and jerked a prop over again and again. The motor caught. He went plunging to the other. Minutes. They caught. He throttled them down to the proper warming-up roaring, while the air in the enclosed space grew foul. Once more to the warehouse. Ortiz shouted and waved his hand. He was filling his pockets with hand grenades. Bell made a gesture of farewell, and Ortiz seemed to smile as he went back to hold the entrance for a little longer. "We're going," said Bell grimly. "Get your guns ready, Jamison, for when the door goes up." He pressed on the button Ortiz had pointed out. There were more explosions and the rattle of firearms from the front of the warehouse. There was a sudden rumble of machinery, and the blank front of the little covered dock rose suddenly. The sunlit waters of Buenos Aires harbor spread out before them. To Bell, who had not looked on sunlight that day, the effect was dazzling. He blinked, and then saw a fast little launch approaching. There were uniformed figures crowded about its bows. "All set," he snapped. "I'm going to give her the gun." "Go to it," said Jamison. "We're—" The motors bellowed and drowned out the rest. The plane shuddered and began to move. The sound of explosions from the back of the warehouse was loud and continuous now. Out into the bright sunlight the plane moved, at first heavily, then swiftly. Bell saw arms waving wildly in the launch with the uniformed men. Sunlight glittered suddenly on rifle barrels. Puffs of vapor shot out. Something spat through the wall beside Bell. But the roaring of the motors kept up, and the pounding of the waves against the curved bow of the boat body grew more and more violent. Sweat came out on Bell's face. This ship was not lifting. But it did lift, slowly, very slowly, carrying every pound with which it could have risen from the water. It swept past the police launch at 90 miles an hour, but no more than 5 feet above the waves. A big, clumsy tramp, flying the Norwegian flag, splashed upriver with its propeller half out of the water. Bell dared to rise a little so he could bank and dodge it. He could not rise above it. He had one glimpse of blonde, astonished beards staring over the stern of the tramp as he swept by it, his wingtips level with its rail and barely 20 feet away. And then he went on and on, out to sea. He began to spiral for height fully 4 miles offshore and looked back at the sprawling city. Down by the waterfront, a thick, curling mass of smoke was rising from one spot abutting on the water. It swayed aside, and Bell saw the rectangular opening out of which the plane had come. "Ortiz is in there," he said, sick at heart, dying as he planned. But there was a sudden upheaval of timbers and roof, a colossal burst of smoke. A long time later, the concussion of a vast explosion. There was nothing left where the warehouse had been. Bell looked and swore softly to himself, and felt the fresh surge of the hatred he bore to the master and all his works. And then the filmy clouds loomed up but a little above the rising plane, and Bell shot into them and straightened out for the south. For many long hours the plane floated on to southward, high above a gray ocean which seemed deceptively placid beneath a canopy of thin clouds. The motors roared steadily in the main, though once Bell instructed Jamison briefly in the maintenance of a proper course and height, and swung out into the terrific blast of air that swept past the wings. He clung to struts and handholds and made his way out on the catwalk to make some fine adjustment in one motor with 6,000 feet of empty space below the swaying wing. "Carburetor wrong," he explained when he had closed the cabin window behind him again, and the motor's roar was once more dulled. It was likely to make a lot of carbon in the cylinders. Okay now. Paula's hand touched his shyly. He smiled abstractedly at her and went back to the controls. And then the plane kept on steadily. Time and space have become purely relative in these days. In startling verification of Mr. Einstein, and the distance between Buenos Aires and Magellan Strait is great or small, a perilous journey or a mere day's travel, according to the mind and the transportation facilities of the voyager. Before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the coast was low and sandy to the westward, and it continued sterile and bare for long hours, while the plane hung high against the sky with a following wind driving it on vastly more swiftly than its own engines could have contrived. It was little before sunset when the character of the shore changed yet again, and the sun was low behind a bank of angry clouds when the stubby forefinger of rock that Magellan optimistically named the Cape of the 11,000 Virgins reached upward from the seemingly placid water. Bell swept lower then, much lower, looking for a landing place. He found it 8 or 9 miles farther in, on a wide, sandy beach some 3 miles from a lighthouse. The little plane splashed down into tumbling sea, and half supported by the waves and half by the lift remaining to its wings, ran for yards up on the hard-packed sand. The landing had been made at late twilight, and Bell moved swiftly when he rose from the pilot's seat. "I'm going over to that lighthouse," he said curtly. "There won't be enough men there to be dangerous, and they probably haven't frequent communication with the town. I'll learn something anyway. You two stay with the plane." Jamison lifted his eyebrows and was about to speak, but looked at Bell's expression and stopped. Leadership is everywhere a matter of emotion and brains together, and though Jamison had his share of brains, he had not Bell's corroding, withering passion of hatred against the master and all who served him gladly. All the way down the coast, Bell had been remembering things he had seen of the master's doing. His power was solely that of fear, and the deputies of his selection had necessarily been men who would spread that terror with an unholy zest. The nature of his hold upon his subjects was such that no honorable man would ever serve him willingly, and for deputies he had need of men even of enthusiasm. His deputies, then, were men who found in the assigned authority of the master full scope for the satisfaction of their own passions. And Bell had seen what those passions brought about, and there was a dull flame of hatred burning in his eyes that would never quite leave them until those men were powerless and the master dead. "You look after the ship and Paula," said Bell impatiently. "All right?" Jamison nodded. Paula looked appealingly at Bell, but he had become a man with an obsession. Perhaps the death of Ortiz had cemented it, but certainly he was unable to think of anything now but the necessity of smashing the ghastly hold of the master upon all the folk he had entrapped. Subconsciously, perhaps, Bell saw in the triumph of the master a blow to all civilization. Less vaguely, he foresaw an attempt at the extension of the master's rule to his own nation. But when Bell thought of the master, mainly he remembered certain disconnected incidents. The girl at Ribiera's luxurious fazenda outside of Rio, who had been ordered to persuade him to be her lover, on penalty of a horrible madness for her infant son if she failed. Of a pale and stricken fazendiero on the Rio Laurenço, who thought him a deputy and humbly implored the grace of the master for a moody 12-year-old girl. Of a young man who kept his father, murder mad, in a barred room in his house, and waited despairingly for that madness to be meted out upon himself and on his wife and children, of a white man who had been kept in a cage in Cuyaba with other men. Bell trudged on through the deepening night with his soul a burning flame of hatred. He clambered amid boulders, guided by the tall lighthouse of Cape Possession, with a little white dwelling he had seen at its base before nightfall. He fell and rose, and forced his way on and upward, and at last was knocking heavily at a trim and neatly painted door. He was so absorbed in his rage that his talk with the lighthouse keeper seemed vague in his memory afterward. The keeper was a wizened little Welshman from the Chibut who spoke English with an extraordinary mixture of a Spanish intonation and a Cimbrian accent. Bell listened heavily and spoke more heavily still. At the end he went back to the plane with a spindle-shanked boy with a lantern accompanying him. "All settled," he said grimly when Jameson came out into the darkness with a ready revolver to investigate the approaching light. "We get a boat from the lighthouse keeper to go to Punta Arenas in. He's a devout member of some peculiar sect, and he's seen enough of the hell Punta Arenas amounts to believe what I told him of its cause. His wife will look after Paula, and this boy will hitch a team to the plane and haul it out of sight early in the morning. With the help of God, we'll kill Ribiera and the Master before sunset tomorrow." End of Chapter 15 of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. Section 14 of Astounding Stories 8, August 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Howell. Astounding Stories 8, August 1930, by Arthur J. Burks. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 16. But they did not kill the Master before nightfall. It was not quite practicable. Bell and Jameson started out well before dawn with a favorable wind and tide, in the small launch the wizened Welshman placed at their disposal. His air was one of dour piety, but he accepted Bell's offer of money with an obvious relief, and criticized his Paraguayan currency with an acid frankness, until Jameson produced Argentine pesos sufficient to pay for the boat 3 times over. "I think," said Jameson dryly, that Miss Canalejas is safe enough until we come back. The keeper is a godly man and knows we have money. She'll be in no danger, except of her soul. They may try to save that." Bell did not answer. He could think of nothing but the mission he had set himself. He tinkered with the engine to make it speed up, and set the sails with infinite care to make every possible advantage of the stiff breeze that blew. During the day, those sails proved almost as much of a nuisance as a help. The fiendish, sullen williwaws that blow furiously and without warning about the strait required watching, and more than once it was necessary to reef everything and depend on the motor alone. Bell watched the horizon ahead with smoldering eyes. Jameson watched him almost worriedly. "Look here, Bell," he said at last. "You'll get nowhere feeling like you do. I know you've done the Master more damage than I have, but you'll just run your head into a trap unless you use your brains. For instance, you didn't ask about communications. There's a direct telegraph wire from Cape Virgins to Buenos Aires, and there's telephonic communication between the Cape and Punta Arenas. Do you imagine that the plane wasn't seen when it came in the Cape? And do you imagine the Master doesn't know we're here?" Bell turned then, and frowned blackly. "I hadn't thought of it," he said grimly. "But I put some hand grenades in the locker there." "You damned fool," said Jameson angrily. Stop being bloodthirsty and use your head. You haven't even asked what I've done. I've done something anyhow. That bundle I chucked in the bow has a couple of sheepmen's outfits in it. Lots of sheep raised around here. We'll put 'em on before we land. And like a good general, I arranged a method of retreat before we left B.A. There'll be a naval vessel here in 2 or 3 days. She's carrying a party of government scientists. She'll anchor in Punta Arenas harbor and announce a case of some infectious disease on board. No shore leave, you see, and nobody from shore permitted on board her. And she has 1 or 2 damn good analytical chemists with a damn good laboratory on board her, too. It's a long gamble, but if we can get a hold of some of the master's poison, do you see? Yes, said Bell heavily. I see. But you haven't been through what I've been through. What I've done, fighting that devil, has caused men to be deserted after being enslaved. There's one place, Cuyaba. His face twitched. That place was in his dreams now. That place and others where human beings had watched their bodies go mad and had been carried about screaming with horror at the crimes those bodies committed. I'm going to kill the master, he rasped. That's all. He settled down to his grim watch for the city. All during the cloudy, overcast day, he strained his eyes ahead. Jameson could make nothing of him. In the end, he had to leave Bell to his moody waiting. The morning passed, and midday, and a long afternoon. 3 times, Bell came restlessly back to the engine and tried to coax more speed out of it. But when darkness fell, the town was still not in sight. They kept on, then, steering by the stars, with the motor putting sturdily away in the stern. The water splashed and rose all about them. The little boat rose and fell again. That's the town, said Bell grimly. It was 11 at night, or later. Lights began to appear very far away, dancing mirage-like on the edge of the water. They grew nearer with almost infinite slowness. 2 wide bands of many lights, with a darker space in which a few much brighter lights showed clearly. Presently a single red light appeared, the Punta Arenas harbor light, 25 feet up on an iron pole. They passed it. Bell, said Jameson curtly, it's time you showed some sense now. We're going to find out some things before we get reckless. This town isn't a big one, but it always was a hell on earth. No extradition from here. It's full of wanted men. It's dying now, from the old days when all ships passed the straits before the Panama Canal opened up. But it ought to still be a hell on earth. And we're going to put on these sheepmen outfits and put up at some low-caste sailors' and sheepmen's hotel on shore and find out what is what. In the morning, if you like. In the morning, said Bell coldly, I'm going to settle with the master. They found a small and filthy hotel in a still filthier street, where the houses were alternately black and silent and empty, and filled with the squalid hilarity most seaport towns can somehow manage to support. The street lamps were white and cold. The dirt and squalor showed the more plainly by their light. There were sailors from the few ships in harbor, and women so haggard and bedraggled that shrill laughter and lavish endearments remained their only allure. And Bell and Jameson plodded to the reeking place in which a half-drunk sheepman pointed, and there Bell sat grimly in the vermin-infested room, while Jameson, swearing wryly, went out. He came back later, much later. His breath was strong of bad whiskey, and he looked like a man who feels that a bath would be very desirable. He looked like a man who feels unclean. "Get me a cigarette," he said shortly. "I found out most of what we want to know." Bell gave him a cigarette and waited. "Good thing you stayed behind," said Jameson. "I want to vomit. Why, people go in hellholes for fun, but I was very drunk and very amorous. Picked up a woman and fed her liquor. Young, too. Damnation, she got crying drunk and told me everything she knew. I gave her money and left. Punta Arenas is the master's, body and soul." "One could have guessed it," said Bell grimly. "Nothing like it is," said Jameson. "Every living creature, man, woman, and child, has been fed that devilish poison of his. The keepers of the dives go fawning to the local officials for the antidote. The jefe politico is driven in his carriage to be cured when red spots form before his eyes. The damn place is full of suicides and women, and oh my God, it's horrible." A humming, buzzing noise set up off in the night somewhere. It kept up for a long time, throttled down. Suddenly it seemed to grow louder, changed in pitch, and dwindled as if into the far, far distance. "That's one of the master's planes now, no doubt," said Jameson savagely. "Going off on some errand for him. He uses this place practically as an experiment station. The human beings here are his guinea pigs. The deputies get a standardized form of the stuff, but he's got it worked out in different doses so he can make a man go mad in hours, if he chooses, instead of after a delay. I don't know how. And the master—" He checked himself sharply. There were shuffling footsteps in the hall outside. A timid tap on the door. Jameson opened it while Bell dropped one hand inconspicuously to a weapon inside his shapeless clothing. The toothless and filthy old man who kept the hotel beamed in at them. "Señores," he cackled. "Vidas son porvenir, no es verdad?" Jameson hiccuped, as one who has been out and been drunken ought to do. "No, viejo," he rumbled tipsily. "Somos de la estancia del señor Rubio. Vaya." The old man seemed to mourn that they did not come from the sheep ranches about Porvenir Bay. But he produced a bottle with a shaking hand, still beaming. "Tengo muchos amigos in Porvenir," he chirped amiably. "Y questa botella—" "Démela," rumbled Jameson. He reached out his hand. "No más que poquito," said the old man, beaming but anxious as Jameson tilted it to his lips. "Es whisky de gentes." He beamed upon Bell, and Bell swallowed a spoonful and seemed to swallow vastly more. He lay back lazily while Jameson and the part of a tipsy sheepherder bullied the old man amiably and eventually chased him out. "You're amused?" asked Jameson sardonically, when there were no more sounds outside. "Because I said you didn't want to meet the young señorita who loved you when she saw you downstairs. Well, Bell, if you used your brain, you didn't swallow any of that stuff." Bell started up. Jameson caught him by the shoulder. "I'm not sure," he said sharply. Of course not, but it's damn funny for a Spanish hotel keeper to give something for nothing, even when he seemed just to want to gossip about his friends. Here, drink this water. It looks vile enough to take the place of mustard." Next morning, the hotel keeper beamed upon them both as they went out of the place. A slatternly, dark-haired girl who leaned on his shoulder smiled invitingly at Bell. And Bell, in his character of a loutish sheep-man from one of the ranches that dot the shores of the strait, grinned awkwardly back. But he went on with Jameson. "We separate," said Jameson under his breath. "We want to find where the master lives, mostly, and then we want to find the laboratory where his stuff is mixed. We don't want to do any killing until that's settled. After all, the trade has something to say." Bell caught it indifferently and began to wander idly about the streets, turning here and there, as if moved by nothing more than the vaguest curiosity. But gradually he was working through the sections in which the larger buildings stood. Concrete structures, astonishingly modern, dotted the business section. But none of them had the air that would surround a place where a man with power of life or death would be. In a town the size of Punta Arenas, there would be unmistakable evidences about the master's residence, even if it were only those who passed it did so hurriedly and with a tinge of fear. There were prosperous men in plenty on the streets, mingled with deserting sailors, stockmen, and farmers from the villages along the strait, and even a few grimy men who looked like miners. But there is a lignite mine not far from the city, and a narrow-gauge railroad running to it. Of the prosperous-seeming men, however, Bell picked out one here and there, toward whom all passers-by adopted a manner of cringing respect. Bell lounged against a pole and studied them thoughtfully. Men with an air of amused and careless scorn, which only men with unlimited power may adopt. He saw one grossly fat man with hard and cruel eyes. The uniformed policeman drove all traffic abjectly out of the way of his carriage, and stood with lifted hat until he had passed. The fat man gave no faintest sign of acknowledgement. "I wonder," said Bell slowly and very grimly, "if that's the master." And then a passer-by dodged quickly past his shoulder, brushing against him, and waited humbly in the street. Bell turned. A party of men were taking up nearly all the sidewalk. There were half a dozen of them in all, and nearly in the middle was the bulky, immaculate, pigmented Ribiera. Bell stiffened. But to move, beyond clearing the way, would be to attract attention. He backed clumsily off the curbing as if making way. And Ribiera looked at his face. Bell's hand drifted near his hidden weapon, but Ribiera looked neither surprised nor alarmed. He halted and chuckled. "Ah, the Senor Bell!" Bell said nothing, looking as stupid as possible, merely because there was nothing else to do. "Ah, do not deny my acquaintance," said Ribiera. He laughed. "I advise you to go and look at the view over the harbor. Good day, Senor Bell." Laughing, he went off along the street, and Bell felt a cold horror creeping over him as he realized what Ribiera might mean. Ribiera had entirely too much against him to greet him only, in a town where even the dogs dared not bark without the master's express command. He had guards with him, men who would have shot Bell down at a nod from Ribiera. Bell burst into a mad run for the waterfront. When the bay spread out before his eyes, he saw what Ribiera meant, and something seemed to snap in his brain. The plane in which he and Jameson and Paula had escaped in was floating out in the harbor. It was unmistakable. A larger, bulkier seaplane floated beside it. The buzzing in the air the night before the arrival of the plane had been telephoned from Cape Virgins. Through a glass, perhaps, even its alighting had been watched, and a big seaplane had gone out to bring it back. Footprints in the sand would lead toward the lighthouse. There would be plenty of men to storm that if necessary, to take the three fugitives. But they would have found only Paula. It was quite possible that the plane had only been sent for after Bell and Jameson had been seen to land in Punta Arenas. And Paula, in the master's hands, would explain Ribiera's amusement perfectly. Bell found Jameson looking hurriedly for him, and Jameson glanced at his utterly white face and said softly, "We want to get where we can't be seen, to talk. There's the devil to pay." "No use hiding," said Bell. His lips seemed stiff. "Paula." "Hide anyway," snapped Jameson. He fairly thrust Bell into an alleyway between two houses and thrust two rounded objects beneath his loose-fitting coat. "2 grenades. I have 2 more. The boat we came in is taken." "So is the plane," said Bell emotionlessly. "And there is a sign, in English, posted where we tied it up. The sign says, 'The Senores Bell and Jameson may recover their boat on application to the master, and may also receive news of a late traveling companion from him.'" We're known, Bell told him, and amazingly found it possible to smile faintly. Ribiera met me on the street and spoke to me and laughed and went on. Jameson stared. Bell's manner was almost entirely normal again. Then Jameson shrugged. The sense of what you're saying, he observed wryly, is that we're licked. Let us, then, go to see the master. I confess I feel some curiosity to know just what he's like. Bell was smiling. Being in an entirely abnormal state, he had a curious certitude of the proper course to adopt. He went up to a policeman and said politely, in Spanish, I am desired to report to the master himself. Will you direct me? The policeman abased himself instantly and trotted with them as a guide. And Bell walked naturally now, with his head up and his shoulders back, and smoked leisurely as he went, and the policeman's abasement became abject. All who walked with that air of amused superiority in Punta Arenas were high in the service of the master. Obviously, the two men in these dejected clothes must also be high in the service of the master, and had adopted their disguise for purposes into which a mere policeman and a slave of the master should not dare inquire. Jameson was rather grim and still. Jameson thought he was walking to his death, and Bell smiled peculiarly and talked almost gaily, and, as Jameson thought, almost irrationally. They came to a house set in a fairly spacious lawn behind a rather high wall. There were greenhouses behind it, and there were flowers growing as well as any flowers can be expected to grow in such high altitudes. It was an extraordinarily cheerful dwelling to be found in Punta Arenas, but the shuddering fear with which the little policeman removed his hat as he entered the gateway was instructive. They were confronted by 4 other policemen, on guard inside the gate. "Estos señores?" began the abject one. "Take us to the master," commanded Bell in a species of amused and superior scorn. "It is required, señor," said the leader of the 4 on guard, very respectfully. "It is required that none enter without being searched for weapons." Bell laughed. "Does the master manage things so?" he asked scornfully. "Now, where I am deputy, no man would dare to think of a weapon to be used against me. If it is the master's rule, though—" The policeman cringed. Bell scornfully thrust an automatic out. "Take it," he snapped, "and go and tell the master that the Señores Bell and Jameson await his pleasure, and that they have given up their weapons." The policeman scuttled toward the house. Bell smiled at his cigarette. "Do you know, Bell," said Jameson dryly, in English, "I'd hate to play poker with you." "I'm not bluffing," said Bell. "Not altogether. I've a 4-card flush, with the draw to come." Almost instantly, the policeman returned, more abject still. He had stammered out Bell's message just as it was given him, and the slaves of the master did not usually disobey orders, especially orders designed to prevent any danger of a doomed man or woman trying to assassinate the master before madness was complete. Bell and Jameson were received by liveried servants in utter silence and conducted through a long passageway, too long to have been contained entirely in the house as seen from the front. Indeed, they came out into a great open greenhouse, in which the smell of flowers was heavy. There were flowers everywhere, and a benign, small, old man with a snowy beard and hair sat at a desk as if chatting of amiable trivialities with the frock-coated men who stood about him. The white-haired old man lifted a blossom delicately to his nostrils and inhaled its perfume with a sensitive delight. He looked up and smiled benignly upon the two. It was then that Jameson got a shock surpassing all the rest. Bell's hands were writhing at the end of his wrists, writhing as if they were utterly beyond his control, and as if they were longing to rend and tear. And Bell suddenly looked down at them, and his expression was that of a man who sees cobras at the ends of his arms. End of Chapter 16 of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster.
Section 15 of Astounding Stories 8, August 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Astounding Stories 8, August 1930 by Arthur J. Burks. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 17. There was a long pause. Bell was very calm. He seemed to tear his eyes from the writhing hands that were peculiarly sensate, as if under the control of an intelligence alien to his own. "I believe," said Bell steadily, "that the master wishes to speak to me." With an apparent tremendous effort of will, he thrust his hands into his pockets. Jameson cursed softly. Bell had taken the direction of things entirely out of his hands. It only remained to play up. "To be sure," said a mild, benevolent voice. The man with the snowy beard regarded Bell exactly in the fashion of an elderly philanthropist. "I am the master, Senor Bell. You have interested me greatly. I have grown to have a great admiration for you. Will you be seated? Your companion also pleases me. I would like," and the mild brown eyes beamed at him, "I would like to have your friendship, Senor Bell." "Pull out a chair for me, Jameson," said Bell in a strained voice, "and I'd like to have a cigarette." Jameson, cursing under his breath, put a chair behind Bell and stuck a cigarette between his lips. He held a match, though his hands shook. "You might sit down too," said Bell steadily. "From the manner of the master, I imagine that the conversation will take some time." He inhaled deeply of his cigarette and faced the little man again. And the master looked so benevolent that he seemed absolutely cherubic, and there was absolutely no sign of anything but the utmost saintliness about him. His eyes were clear and mild. His complexion was fresh and translucent. The wrinkles that showed upon his face were those of an amiable and a serene soul filled with benevolence and charity. He looked like one of those irritatingly optimistic old gentlemen who habitually carry small coins and stray bits of candy in their pockets for such small children as they may converse with under the smiling eyes of nurses. "Ah, Senor Bell," he said gently, "you do cause me to admire you. May I see your hands again?" Bell held them out. He seemed to have conquered their writhing to some extent, but he could not hold them quite still. Sweat stood out on his forehead. He thrust them abruptly out of sight again. "Sad," said the master gently, "very sad." He sighed faintly and laid down the rose he had been toying with. His fingers caressed the soft petals delicately. "Fortunately," he said benevolently, "it is not yet too late for me to relieve the strain under which you labor, Senor. May I send for a certain medicine which will dispose of those symptoms in a very short time?" "We'll talk first," said Bell harshly. "I want to hear what you have to say." The master nodded, his fingers touching the rose petals as if in a sensitive pleasure in their texture. "Always courageous," he said benignly. "I admire it while I combat it. But the Senor Jameson—" Jameson had been looking fascinatedly at his own hands, opening and closing the fingers with a savage abruptness. They obeyed him, though they trembled. "I didn't drink the damned stuff that hotel keeper brought us last night," he growled. "Bell did, and I—" "Wait a minute, Jameson," said Bell evenly. "Let's talk to the master for a while. I swore, sir," he said grimly, "that I'd kill you. I've seen what your devilish poison does in the hands of the men you've chosen to distribute it. I've seen," he swallowed and said harshly, "I've seen enough to make me desire nothing so much as to see you roast in hell. But you wanted to talk to me. Go ahead." The master beamed at him, and then glanced about at the frock-coated men who had been attending him. Bell glanced at them. Ribiera was there, chuckling. "I told you, Tio mio," he said familiarly, "that he would not be polite. You can do nothing with him. Better have him shot." Francia, of Paraguay, nodded amusedly to Bell as their eyes met, but the master shook his really rather beautiful head. An old man can be good to look at, and with a saintly aureole of snow-white hair and the patriarchal white beard, the master was the picture of benign and beautiful old age. "Ah, you do not understand," he protested mildly. "The more the Senor Bell shows his courage, Tio mio, the more we must persuade him." He turned to Bell. "I realize," he said gently, "that there are hardships connected with the administration of my power, Senor. It is inevitable. But the Latin races of the continent, which is now nearly mine, require strong handling. They require a strong man to lead them. They are comfortably only under despotism. The task I have chosen for you is different entirely. Los Americanos del Norte will not respond to the treatment which is necessary for those del Sud. Their governments, their traditions, are entirely unlike. If you become my deputy and viceroy for all your nation, you shall rule as you will. A benevolent yet strong rule is needed for your people. It may even be, I will permit it, that the democratic institutions of your nation may continue if you so desire. I am offering you, Senor, the position of the absolute ruler of your nation. You may interfere with the present government not at all if you choose, provided only that my own commands are obeyed when relayed through you. I choose you because you have courage and resource, and because you have the Yankee cleverness which will understand your nation and cope with it." Bell inhaled deeply. "In other words," he said bitterly, "you're saying indirectly that you offer me a chance to be the sort of ruler Americans will submit to without too much fuss, because you think one of Ribiera's stamp would drive them to rebellion." The fine dark eyes twinkled. "You have much virtue, Senor. My nephew, though he is to be my successor, has a weakness for a pretty face. Would you prefer that I give him the task of subduing your nation?" "You might try it," said Bell. His eyes gleamed. "He'll be dead within a week." The master laughed softly. "I like you, Senor. I do like you indeed. I have not been so defied since another Americano del Norte defied me in this same room. But he had not your resource. He had been enslaved with much less difficulty than yourself. I do not remember what happened to him." "He was taken, master," said a fat man with hard eyes obsequiously. "He was taken in Bolivia. It was the man whom Bell had seen earlier that morning in a carriage. You gave him to me. He had insulted me when I ordered him sent to you. I had him killed, but he was very obstinate." "Ah, yes," said the master meditatively. "You told me the details." He seemed to recall small facts in benevolent retrospection. "But you, Senor Bell, I have need of you. In fact, I shall insist upon your friendship, and therefore—" He beamed upon Bell. "I give you back the Senorita Canalejas." He shook his head reproachfully at the utterly grim look in Bell's eyes. "I shall give you one single portion of the antidote to the medicine which makes your hands behave so badly. You may take it when you please. The Senor Jameson I shall keep and enslave. I do not think he will be as obstinate as you are, but he has excellent qualities. If you prove obdurate, I may yet persuade him to undertake certain tasks for me, but you and the Senorita Canalejas are free. Your boat has been reprovisioned and provided with fuel. You may go from here where you will." Ribiera snarled. "Tio mio," he protested angrily. "You promised me." "Your will in many things," said the master gently, "but not in all. Remember that you have much to learn, hijo mio. I have taught you to prepare my little medicine, it is true. That is so that you can take my place, if age infirmity shall carry me away." The master folded his hands with an air of pious resignation. "But you must learn policy. The Senorita Canalejas belongs to the Senor Bell." Jameson was staring now, but Bell's eyes had narrowed to mere slits. "You see," said the master gently to him, "I desire your friendship. You may go where you will. You may take the Senorita Canalejas with you. You will have enough of the antidote to my little medicine to keep you sane for perhaps a week. In 1 week you may go far with her. You may do many things, but you cannot find a place of safety for her. I still have a little power, Senor. If you take her with you, your hands will writhe again. Your body will become uncontrollable. Your eyes, staring and horror-struck, will observe your own hands rending her. While your brain is yet sane, you will see this body of yours, which now desires her so ardently, tearing at and crushing that delicate figure, gouging out her eyes, battering her tender flesh, destroying her. Have you ever seen what a man who has taken my little medicine does to a human being at his mercy?" The figures about the master were peculiarly tense. The fat man with the hard eyes laughed suddenly. It was a horrible laugh. Francia of Paraguay took out his handkerchief and delicately wiped his lips. He was smiling. Ribiera looked at Bell's face and chuckled. His whole gross figure shook with his amusement. "And of course," said the master benignly, "if you prefer to commit suicide, if you prefer to leave her here, well, my nephew knows little expedients to reduce her will to compliance. You recall Yagué, among others?" Bell's face was a white mask of horror and fury. He tried to speak and failed. He raised his hand to his throat, and it tore at the flesh insanely. Let me see her, croaked Bell, as if strangling. Jameson stiffened. Bell seemed to be trying to get his hands into his pockets. They were apparently uncontrollable. He thrust them under his coat as there was a stirring at the door. And Paula was brought in as if she had been waiting. She was entirely colorless, but she smiled at Bell. She came quickly to his side. "I heard," she said in a clear and even little voice. "We will go together, Charles. If there is a week in which we can be together, it will be so much of happiness. And when you are the Master's victim, we will let the little boat sink, and sink with it. I do not wish to live without you, Charles, and you do not wish to live as his slave." Bell gave utterance to a sudden laugh that was like a bark. His hands came out from under his coat. Dangling from each one was a small pear-shaped globule of metal. A staff projected upward from each one, and he held those staffs in his writhing hands. About each wrist was a tiny loop of cord that went down to a pin at the base of the staffs. "Close to me, Paula," he said coldly. She clung to his arm. He moved forward with a half-dozen revolver muzzles pointed at his breast. "If one of you damned fools fires," he said harshly, "I'll let go. When I let go, these are Mills grenades, and they go off in 3 seconds after they leave the hand. Stand still." There was a terrible frozen silence. Then a movement from behind Bell. Jameson was rising with a grunt. "Some day, Bell," he observed coolly, "I'll be on to all of your curves. This is the best one yet, but you're likely to let go at any second, aren't you?" "Like hell," raged Bell. "I drank some of your poison," he snarled at the Master. "Yes, I was fool enough to do it, but I took what measures any man will take who finds he's swallowed poison. I got it out of my stomach at once, and if you or one of these deputies tries to move—" Ribiera had blanched to a pasty gray. The Master was frozen. But Bell saw Ribiera's eyes move in swift calculation. There was a solid wall behind the Master. It seemed as if the greenhouse were a sort of passageway between two larger structures, and there was a door almost immediately behind Ribiera. Ribiera glanced right, left. He flung himself through that door. He knew the secret of the Master's power. He was the Master's appointed successor. If the Master and all his deputies died, Ribiera— But Bell snapped into action like a bent spring released. His arm shot forward. A grenade went hurtling through the door through which Ribiera had fled. There was an instantaneous, terrific explosion. The solid wall shook and shivered and, with a vast deliberation, collapsed. The greenhouse was full of crushed plaster dust. Panes of glass shivered. But Bell was upon the Master. He had struck the little man down and stood over him, his remaining automatic replacing the grenade he had thrown. "Ribiera's dead," he snapped, "and if I'm shot the Master dies too, and you all go mad. Stand back." The deputies stood frozen. "I think," said Jameson composedly, "I take a hand now. I'll pick him up, Bell. Right, I've got him, with a grenade hanging down his back. If he jerks away from me or I from him, it will blow his spine to bits." "Hold him so," said Bell coldly. He went coolly to where he could look over the heap of the collapsed wall. He saw a bundle of torn clothing that had been a man. It was flung against a cracked and tottering chimney. "Right," he said evenly. "Ribiera's dead, all right." He turned to the deputies, whose revolvers were still in their hands. "The Master's carriage, please," he said politely. "To the door. You may accompany us if you please, but in other carriages. I am working for the release of all the Master's slaves, and you among them if you choose. But you can see very easily that there is no hope of the release of the Master without the meeting of my terms." The Master spoke, softly and mildly, and without fear. "It is my order that the Senor Bell is to be obeyed. I shall return. You need have no fear of my death. My carriage." A man went stiffly, half paralyzed with terror, to where chattering, scared servants were grouped in the awful fear that came upon the slaves of the Master at any threat to his rule. But Bell and Paula and Jameson went slowly and cautiously, though they held the whip hand, to the entrance door of the house and out to the entrance gate. A carriage was already there before the door when they reached it, and others were drawing up in a line behind it. "Get in," said Bell briefly, "down to the waterfront." He turned to the group of frock-coated, stricken men who had followed. "Some of you men," he said coldly, "had better go on ahead and warn the police and the public generally about the certainty of the Master's death if any attempt is made to rescue him." Francia of Paraguay summoned a swagger and raised his hand to the second carriage. It drew in to the curb. "I will attend to it, Senor Bell," he said politely. when I think that I once raised my revolver to shoot you and refrained." He drove off swiftly. Bell's eyes were glowing. He got into the carriage, and such a procession drove through the streets of Punta Arenas as had rarely moved through the streets of any city in the world. The long line of carriages moved at a funeral pace amid a surging, terrified mob. The master beamed placidly as he looked out over white, starkly agonized faces. Some of the people groaned audibly. A few cursed the master in their despair. More cursed Bell, not daring to strike or fire on him. But he would have been torn to bits if he had stepped from the carriage for an instant. "Bell," said Jameson dryly, "considering that I'm prepared to be blown apart on 3 seconds' notice, it is peculiar that this mob frightens me." The master's eyes twinkled benignly. He seemed totally insensible to fear. "You need not be afraid," he said gently. "They will not touch you unless I order them." Jameson stared down at the little man whose collar he held firmly, with a Mills grenade dangling down at the base of his neck. "I wouldn't order them to attack if I were you," he said coldly. "I haven't Bell's brains, but I have just as much dislike for you as he has." They came to the harbor. Bell spoke again. "The carriage is to drive out to the end of one of the docks, and no one else is to go out on that dock." The master relayed the order in his mild voice, but as the coachman obeyed him he clucked his tongue commiseratingly. "Senor Bell," he protested gently, "you do not expect to escape. Not after killing me. Why, that is absurd." Bell said nothing. He alighted from the carriage, his face set grimly, and stared ashore at the long, long row of terrified faces staring out at him. The whole waterfront seemed to be lined with staring faces. Wails came from that mass of enslaved human beings. "Hold him here, Jameson," he said drearily. "I'm going out to look at that big plane. There's a rowboat tied to the dock there." He swung down the side into the dock and rowed off into the harbor, while the horses attached to the master's carriage pawed impatiently at the wooden flooring of the dock. Bell reached the 2 planes anchored on the still harbor water. The small one had brought them down from Buenos Aires. The larger one had gone after the beached amphibian and brought it and Paula onto the city. Bell, from the shore, was seen to be investigating the larger one. He came rowing back. His head appeared above the dock edge. "All right," he said tiredly. "The master has a rule requiring all his ships ready for instant flight. Very useful. The big plane is fueled and full of oil. We'll go out to it and take off." Jameson lifted the master to his feet, and with a surge of muscles swept him down to the flooring of the dock. "Paula first," said Bell, "and then the master, and then you, Jameson." "One moment," said the master reproachfully. "It would be cruel not to let me reassure my subjects. I will give an order." Bell and Jameson listened suspiciously, but he spoke gently to the coachman. "You will tell the deputies," said the master in Spanish, "that a month's supply of medicine for all my subjects will be found in my laboratory, and you may tell them that I shall return before the end of that time." The coachman's eyes filled with a passionate relief. "Now," said the master placidly, "I am ready for our little jaunt." Paula descended the ladder and seated herself in the bow of the boat. Bell covered the master grimly with his automatic as he descended, with surprising agility. Jameson came down last and resumed his former grip on the master's collar. Bell rowed out to the big plane. Jameson kept close watch while Bell started the 4 huge motors and throttled them down to warming up speed, and while he hauled up the anchor with which the huge seaplane was anchored. The dock was covered with a swarm of panic-stricken folk. Everywhere all the inhabitants of the city who were slaves to the master had come in awful terror to watch. And all the inhabitants of the city were slaves to the master. Some of them fell to their knees and held out imploring arms to Bell, begging him for mercy and the return of the master. Some cursed wildly. But with his jaws set grimly, Bell gave the motors the gun. The big plane moved heavily, then more swiftly through the water. It lifted slowly and rose and dwindled to a speck high in the air. And all through the streets and ways of Punta Arenas, fear stalked almost as a tangible thing. Panic hovered over the housetops, always ready to descend. Terror was in the air that every man breathed, and every human being looked at every other human being with staring, haunted eyes. Punta Arenas was waiting for its murder madness to begin. End of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 17. Section 16 of Astounding Stories 8, August 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Astounding Stories 8, August 1930 by Arthur J. Burks. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 18. There were 4 motors to pull the big plane through the air, and their roaring was a vast, thundering noise which the earth re-echoed. But inside the cabin that tumult was reduced to a not intolerable humming sound. "What'll I do with this devil, Bell?" asked Jameson. "Now that we're aloft, I confess this grenade makes me nervous. I'm holding it so tightly my fingers are getting cramped." "Tie him up," said Bell without looking. "He'll talk presently." Movements. The plane flew on, swaying slightly in the way of big seaplanes everywhere. A willowaw began in the hills ahead and swept out and set the ship to reeling crazily in its erratic currents. The strait vanished and there were tumbled hills below them. Minutes passed. "Got him fixed up," said Jameson coolly. "I'll guarantee he won't break loose. Got any plans, Bell?" "No time," said Bell. "I haven't had time to make any. The first thing is to get where his folk will never find us. Then we'll see what we can do with them." Paula looked at the now bound figure of the master, and the little old man beamed at her. He's smiling," said Paula in a voice that was full of a peculiar horrified shock. Bell shrugged. Punta Arenas was all of 25 miles behind, and the earth over which they flew began to take on the shape of an island. Water appeared beyond it, and innumerable small islands. Bell began to rack his brain for the infinitesimal scraps of knowledge he had about this section of the world. It was pitifully scanty. Punta Arenas was the southernmost point of the continental mass. All about it was an archipelago and a maze of waterways, thinly inhabited everywhere and largely without any inhabitants at all. The only solid ground between Cape Horn and the Antarctic ice pack was Diego Ramirez and the South Shetlands. Nothing to go on, but any sufficiently isolated and desolate spot would do. Almost anywhere along the southern edge of the continental islands should serve. The plane roared on monotonously, while Bell began to wrestle with another and more serious problem. In 3 days, 2 now, an American naval vessel would turn up, with scientists and chemists on board. It was to be doubted whether anything like an overt act would be risked by that vessel. If all the governments of South America were under the master's thumb, then cabled orders from his deputies would race 3 navies to the spot. And the government of the United States does not like to start war anywhere. Certainly it would not willingly enter into a conflict with the whole southern continent for the solution of a problem that so far affected that continent alone. The master's kidnapping had solved nothing so far. Jameson tapped his shoulder. "No pursuit so far," he observed coolly. "I've looked." Bell nodded. "They don't dare. Not yet, anyhow. They're depending on the master. How is he?" "Smiling peacefully to himself, damn him," snarled Jameson. "Do you know what we're up against?" "Ourselves," said Bell coldly. "But I'm nearly licked. He's got to talk." Jameson moved away again. The earth below looked as if it had been torn to shreds in some titanic convulsion of ages past. The sea was everywhere, and so was land. There were little threads of silver interlacing and crossing and wavering erratically in every conceivable direction. And there were specks of islands, rocks only yards in extent, and islands of every imaginable size and shape, with their surfaces in every possible state of upheaval and distortion. A broader mass of land appeared ahead and to the left. "Tierra del Fuego again," muttered Bell. "If we cross it—" For 15 minutes the plane thundered across desolate, rocky hills, then the maze of islets again. Bell scanned them keenly and saw a tiny steamer traveling smokily for no conceivable reason among the scattered bits of stone. The sea appeared, stretching out toward infinity. Bell rose to survey a wider space. He swung to the left so that he was heading nearly southeast, and went on down toward that desolation of desolations, the stormy cape which faces the eternal ice of the Antarctic. He was 5,000 feet up then, and scanning sea and earth and sky. And suddenly he swung sharply to the right and headed out toward the open sea. He felt a small figure pressing against his shoulder. Presently fingers closed tightly upon his sleeve. He glanced down at Paula and managed to smile. "There are some rocks out there," he told her quietly. "Islands, I think, and Diego Ramirez at a guess." They were specks, no more, but they were vastly more distinct from the plane than from Mount Beaufoy. That is, on Henderson Island in New Year Sound, and its 1,700-foot peak was almost below Bell when he sighted the islands, but the islands had been seen full 50 miles from there. It took the plane nearly 40 minutes to cover the space, but long before that the islands had become distinct. 2 tiny groups of scattered rocks, the whole group hardly 5 miles in length, and by far the greater number no more than boulders surrounded by sheets of foam from breakers. 2 of them merited the name of islands. The nearer was high and bare and precipitous. No trace of vegetation showed upon it. The farther was smaller, and at its northern corner a little cove showed, nearly landlocked. Bell descended steeply. The big plane plunged wildly in the air eddies about the taller island at 500 feet, but steadied and went winging on down lower and lower. The waves between the 2 islands were not high, but the seaplane alighted with a tremendous splashing, and Bell navigated it grimly, though clumsily, into the mouth of the cove. There a small beach showed. He went very slowly toward it. Presently he swung abruptly about. A wing-tip float grounded close to the shore. The motors cut off and left a thunderous silence. Bell climbed atop the cabin and let go the anchor. "We're here," he said shortly. "Bring the master and we'll go ashore." The catwalk painted on the lower wing guided them. Bell jumped to the rocks first and stumbled, and then rose to lift Paula down and take the master's small, frail body from Jameson's arms. "You looked for a gun?" asked Bell. "He'd nothing to fight with," said Jameson heavily. He had been facing the same problem Bell had worked on desperately and had found no answer. But he shuddered a little as he looked about the island. There was nothing in sight but rock. No moss, no lichens, not even stringy grass or the tufty scrub bushes that seemed able to grow anywhere. Bell untied the master, carefully but without solicitude. The little man sat up and brushed himself off carefully and arranged himself in a comfortable position. "I am an old man," said the master in mild reproach. "You might at least have given me a cushion to sit upon." Bell sat down and lighted a cigarette with fingers that did not tremble in the least. "Suppose," he said harshly, "you talk. First, of what your poison is made. Second, of what the antidote is made. Third, how we may be sure you tell the truth." The master looked at him with bright, shrewd, and apparently kindly old eyes. "Dio mio," he said mildly. "I am an old man, but I am obstinate. I will tell you nothing." Bell's eyes glowed coldly. "Does it occur to you," he asked grimly, "that it's too important a matter for us to have any scruples about? That we can and will make you talk?" "You may kill me," said the master benignly, "but that is all." "And," said Bell still more grimly, "we have only to get back in the plane yonder and go away." The master beamed at him. Presently he began to laugh softly. "Dio mio," he said gently, "let us stop this little by-play. You will take me back in my airplane, and you will land me at Punta Arenas, and then you will fly away. I concede you freedom, but that is all. You cannot leave me here." "Paula," said Bell coldly, "get in the plane again. Jameson." Paula rose doubtfully. Jameson stood up. The master continued to chuckle amiably. "You see," he said cherubically, "you happen to be a gentleman, Senor Bell. Every man has some weakness. That is yours, and you will not leave me here to die because you have killed my nephew, who was the only other man who knew how to prepare my little medicine. And you know, Senor, that all my subjects wish to die. Those who do, in fact," he added mildly, "will be fortunate. The effect of my little medicine does not make for happiness without its antidote." Bell's hands clenched. "You know," said the master comfortably, "that there are many thousands of people whose hands will writhe very soon. The city of Punta Arenas will be turned into a snarling place of maniacs within a very little while, if I do not return. Would you like, Senor, to think in after days of that pleasant city filled with men and women tearing each other like beasts, of little children even, crouching and crushing and rending the tender flesh of other little children? Of lisping little ones gone—" "Stop!" snarled Bell in a frenzy. "Damn your soul! You're right. I can't—" "You win so far." "Always," said the master benevolently. "I win always. And you forget, Senor. You have seen the worst side of my rule, the revolutions, the rebellions that have made men free. Were they pretty things to watch? Always, amigo, the worst comes, but when my rule is secure, then you shall see." He waved a soft, beautifully formed hand. From every possible aspect the situation was a contradiction of all reason. The bare, black, salt-encrusted rocks with no trace of vegetation showing. The grey water rumbling and surging among the uneven rocks at the base of the shore, while gulls screamed hoarsely overhead. the white-haired little man with his benevolent face, smiling confidently at the two grim men. "The time will come," said the master gently, and in the tone of utter confidence with which one states an inescapable fact. "The time will come when all the earth will know my rule. The taking of my little medicine will be as commonplace a thing as the smoking of tobacco, which I abhor, senores. You are mistaken about there being an antidote and a poison. It is one medicine only, one little compound, a vegetable substance, Senor Bell, combined with a product of modern chemistry. It is a synthetic drug. Modern chemistry is a magnificent science, and my little medicine is its triumph. Even my deputies have not heard me speak so, senores." Bell snarled wordlessly, but if one had noticed his eyes, they would have been seen to be curiously cool and alert and waiting. The master leaned forward and for once spoke seriously, almost reverently. "There shall be a forward step, senores, in the race of men. Do you know the difference between the brain of a man and that of an anthropoid ape? It consists only of a filmy layer of cortex, a film of gray nerve cells which the ape has not. And that little layer creates the difference between ape and man, and I have discovered more. My little medicine acts upon that film. Administered in the tiny quantities I have given to my slaves, it has no perceptible effect. It is merely a compound of a vegetable substance and a synthetic organic base. It is not excreted from the body. Like lead, it remains always in solution in the blood. But in or out of the blood it changes always to the substance which causes murder madness, fresh or changed. My little medicine acts upon the brain." He smiled brightly upon them. "But though in tiny quantities, it has but little effect. In larger quantities, when fresh, it makes the functioning of the gray cells of the human brain as far superior to the unmedicated gray cells as those human gray cells are to the white cells of the ape. That is what I have to offer to the human race, intelligence for every man which shall be as genius of the past." He laughed softly. "Think, senores. Compare the estate of men with the estate of apes. Compare the civilization which will arise upon the earth when men's brains are as far above their present level as the present level is above the anthropoid. The upward steps of the human race under my rule will surpass the advance from brutish cavemen to intellectual genius. But I have seen, senores, the one danger in my offering." There was silence. Jameson shook his head despairingly. The master could not see him. He formed the word with his lips. "Crazy." But Bell said coldly, "Go on." "I must rule," said the master soberly. "It is essential. If my little secret were known, intelligences would be magnified, but under many flags and with many aims. Scientists, with genius beside which Newton's pales, would seek out deadly weapons for war. The world would destroy itself of its own genius. But under my rule—" "Men go mad," said Bell coldly. The master smiled reproachfully. "Ah, you are trying to make me angry, so that I will betray something. You are clever, Senor Bell, with my little medicine in such quantities as I would administer it to you." "You describe it," said Bell harshly and dogmatically, "as a brain stimulant, but it drives men mad." "To be sure," said the master mildly, "it does. It is not excreted from the body save very, very slowly, but it changes in the bloodstream as, let us say, sugar changes into alcohol in digestion. The end product of my little medicine is a poison which attacks the brain. But the slightest bit of unchanged medicine is an antidote. It is," he smiled amiably, "it is as if sugar in the body changed to alcohol. And alcohol was a poison, but sugar, unchanged, was an antidote. That is it exactly. You see that I have taken my little medicine for years, and it has not harmed me." "Which," said Bell, and somehow his manner made utter silence fall so that each word fell separately into a vast stillness, "which, thank God, is the one thing that wins finally, for me." He stood up and laughed, quite a genuine laugh. "Paula," he said comfortably, "get on the plane, in the cabin. Jameson and I are going to strip the master." Paula stared. The master looked at him blankly. Jameson frowned bewilderedly, but stood up grimly to obey. "But, senor," said the master in gentle dignity, "merely to humiliate me?" "Not for that," said Bell. He laughed again. But all the time I've been hearing about the stuff, I've noticed that nobody thought of it as a drug. It was a poison. People were poisoned. They did not become addicts, but you are the only addict to your drug." He turned to Jameson, his eyes gleaming. "Jameson," he said softly, "did you ever know of a drug addict who could bear to think of ever being without a supply of his drug right on his person?" Jameson literally jumped. "By God, no!" The master was quick. He was swarming up the plain wing tip before Jameson reached him, and he kicked frenziedly when Jameson plucked him off. But then it was wholly, entirely, utterly horrible that the little white-haired man, whose face and manner had seemed so cherubic and so bland, should shriek in so complete a blind panic as they forced his fingers open and took a fountain pen away from him. "This is it," said Bell in a deep satisfaction. "This is his point of weakness." The master was ghastly to look at now. Jameson held him gently enough, considering everything, but the master looked at that fountain pen as one might look at paradise. I swear," he gasped, "I swear I will give you the formula." "You might lie," said Jameson grimly. "I swear it," panted the master in agony. If the formula is known, it can be duplicated. The excretion can be hastened. It can all be forced from the body, simply, so simply, if only you know. I will tell you how it is done. The medicine is the cacodylate of—" Bell was leaning forward now, like a runner breasting the tape at the end of a long and exhausting race. "I'll trade," he said softly, "half the contents of the pen for the formula. The other half we'll need for analysis. Half the stuff in the pen for the formula for freeing your slaves." The master sobbed. A pencil," he gasped. "I swear." Jameson gave him a pencil and a notebook. He wrote, his hands shaking. Jameson read inscrutably. "It doesn't mean anything to me," he said soberly, "but you can read it. It's legible." Bell smiled faintly. With steady finger he took his own fountain pen from his pocket. He emptied it of ink and put a scrupulous half of a milky liquid from the master's pen into it. He passed it over. "Your medicine," said Bell quietly, "may taste somewhat of ink, but it will not be poisonous. Now, what do we do with you? I give you your choice. If we take you with us, you will be held very secretly as a prisoner until the truth of the information you have given us can be proven. And if your slaves have all been freed, then I suppose you will be tried." The master was drawn and haggard. He looked very, very old and beaten. I would prefer," he said dully, "that you did not tell where I am, and that you go away and leave me here. I may have some subjects who will search for me, and they may discover me here, but I am beaten, Senor. You know that you have won." Bell swung up on the wing of the plane. He explored about in the cabin, and he came back. "There are emergency supplies," he said coldly. "We will leave them with you, with such things as may be useful to allow you to hope as long as possible. I do not think you will ever be found here." I prefer it, Senor," said the master dully. I will catch fish." Jameson helped put the packages ashore. The master shivered. Bell stripped off his coat and put it on top of the heap of packages. The master did not stir. Bell laid a revolver on top of his coat. He went out to the plane and started the motors. The master watched apathetically as the big seaplane pulled clumsily out of the little cove. The rumble of the engines became a mighty roar. It started forward with a rush, skimmed the water for 200 yards or so, and then suddenly lifted clear to go floating away through the air toward the north. Paula was the only one who looked back. "He's crying," she said uncomfortably. "It isn't fear," said Bell quietly. "It's grief at the loss of his ambition. It may not seem so to you two, but I believe he meant all that stuff he told me. He was probably really aiming, in his own way, for an improved world for men to live in." The plane roared on. Presently Bell said shortly, "That stuff he has won't last indefinitely. I'm glad I left him that revolver." Jameson stirred suddenly. He dug down in his pocket and fished out a cigar. "Since I feel that I may live long enough to finish smoking this," he observed dryly, "I think I'll light it. I haven't felt that I had 20 minutes of life ahead of me for a long time now. A sense of economy made me smoke cigarettes. It wouldn't be so much waste if you left half a cigarette behind you when you were killed." The tight little cabin began to reek of the tobacco. Paula pressed close to Bell. "But, Charles," she asked hopefully, is Is it really all right now?" "I think so," said Bell, frowning. "Our job's over, anyhow. We go up the Chilean coast and find that Navy boat. We turn our stuff over to them. They'll take over the task of seeing that every doctor, everywhere in South America, knows how to get the master's poison out of the system of anybody who's affected. Some of them won't be reached, but most of them will. I looked at his formula. Standard drugs, all of them. There won't be any trouble getting the news spread. The master's slaves will nearly go crazy with joy. And," he added grimly, "I'm going to see to it that the Rio police take back what they said about us. I think we'll have enough pull to demand that much." He was silent for a moment or two, thinking. "I do think, Jameson," he said presently, "we did a pretty good job." Jameson grunted. If it's really over," said Paula hopefully, "Charles—" "What?" "You will be able to think about me sometimes?" asked Paula wistfully. "Instead of about the master always?" Bell stared down at her. "Good Lord," he groaned. "I have been a brute, Paula, but I've been loving you—" He stopped, and then said with the elaborate politeness and something of the customary idiotic air of a man making such an announcement, "I say, Jameson, did you know Paula and I were to be married?" Jameson snorted. Then he said placidly, "No, of course not. I never dreamed of such a thing. When did this remarkably original idea occur to you?" He puffed a huge cloud of smoke from his cigar. It was an unusually vile cigar. Bell scowled at him helplessly for a moment, and then said wrathfully, "Oh, go to hell." And he bent over and kissed Paula. The end. In the next issue, Jetta of the Lowlands, beginning an exciting 3-part novel of the Nares Deep by Ray Cummings. An Attack from Space, a sequel to Beyond the Heaviside Layer by Captain S.P. Meek. Marooned Under the Sea, a thrilling novelette of the ocean floor by Paul Ernst. Earth, the Marauder, the conclusion of the tremendous novel by Arthur J. Burks, and others. End of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 18.